Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ray, and welcome to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. In this podcast, we'll keep you up to date with the latest app development tech talk. Now, here are your hosts, Dru Freeman and Nishant Shrivastava.
Thanks, Ray. This is the RayWenderlich.com podcast. Welcome to episode 6 for season 11. This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 4th of February, 2021, for release on the 17th of February. This episode was sponsored by the language Esperanto, kaj per la numero es. Did you keep up? I'm Dru Freeman, along with my non-sequitur co-host, Nishant Shrivastava.
Thanks, Dru. In this episode, we tap into the experience of Ty Smith, who has also contributed to the book Living by the Code. Ty Smith is someone who wears many hats. He's a GD for Android, tech lead at Uber, angel investor, and many more. Let's find out in this episode.
Ty, welcome to the show.
Thanks, folks. Happy to be here.
And happy that we got the episode going, as I can confide to our listeners the technical and work gaps that we had coming into this episode were many and fun. But we are here now. And first of all, I want to thank you, because the first thing that I read in your chapter made me very happy. And that is a question that I ask most of our guests is, what do you do for fun when you're not doing code or computer things? And you actually have a list.
Well, it's staying at home with coronavirus quarantine, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is that. Is everything okay with you and yours?
Yeah, I think everything's great. I think that when the book was written, that was a much more optimistic and exciting list than what most people are doing these days.
Well, I guess the traveling and the wine tasting and the like are out at the moment.
Yeah, most of those adventures and sports are a little harder to do these days. But
so where have you traveled?
Where have I traveled? During coronavirus? Nowhere. Before
No. When traveling was part of the
Sure. So I started kind of traveling for advocacy, like tech advocacy and public speaking, 6 or 7 years ago. And since then, I've got to go all over and visit all kinds of really cool places and speak at tons of events to developers from all over the place, from Thailand to France to Italy to Canada to Sao Paulo, in Brazil, all kinds of really, really great places. Developers everywhere, super smart and enthusiastic and always excited to learn and engage with the community.
So the wine tasting, I take it, has to stop because you don't just buy new bottles of wine and taste them at home. You actually like going out to the vineyards.
Yeah, it's a little more fun. I live in the Bay Area, so getting up to Sonoma and Napa, or going down to like Paso Robles or the different regions. It's always fun to kind of see the agricultural areas and visit the vineyards and meet the vintners and talk through their passion for it.
Have you made it up into Oregon or Washington?
No, I haven't done any wine tasting in Oregon or Washington, but I've heard great things about.
Yeah, there's some wonderful places in Washington, about 2.5, 3 hours north of Seattle.
Yeah, I've heard that. An interesting one that I went to a couple years ago, the Guadalajara Valley outside of San Diego across the border is a really interesting and up and coming wine region. I think they have, if I recall, it was like 450 vineyards in that very small area. And it was a really interesting day trip coming across the border, taking a tour of a few different beautiful vineyards with that like desert aesthetic. Lots of really interesting stuff that isn't as popular in the States. Like they're growing a lot of Nebbiolo now, which is interesting. Hard to kind of find in the US, but one of my favorite grape varietals.
Now, as you mentioned, we're all in the middle of COVID and the lockdown and the like. I assume you're working remotely now, like most engineers. Were you originally working remotely with your current company, or was that sort of a COVID benefit?
It's definitely a COVID benefit, but I would say, I've been at Uber 5 years and been very active in the community through Uber as well. So that takes me to a lot of conferences and events and different things like that. We've always had a huge amount of flexibility when it comes to traveling, working remotely, flexible work environments. We have an office here, had multiple offices before, and I'd usually spend a few days a week in the office and a couple of days a week, at home focusing. It was a little easier to get into the flow.
But now it's pretty much all home all the time.
That's right.
How are you managing to keep with the sanity of it all? Are you having any kind of variety in your day, or is it just trudge through?
I definitely can parallel or give an analogy to Groundhog Day. I think that a lot of folks have said similar. Time kind of has disappeared, but I really enjoy working with my team and the type of work that we're doing, and there's a lot of very interesting and exciting projects that are always coming through, and that keeps me pretty engaged on the work side of it. While it's I'm pretty focused on like sustainability and my own well-being. So I've managed during COVID well enough.
Now, just so I can follow up, you found your way into Android, and I believe the best term in the world you used was you were basically voluntold to do a project.
Yeah, pretty much. About late 2008 or 2009, I was working for a little consultancy in Dallas, and they had got a project for Zagat, the restaurant review company.
Mm-hmm.
That was doing like print books up until then, to do their first iOS and Android and do some investment in the web for them. And this was through it was like subcontracted through another bigger company. And we had I was doing Ruby on Rails at the time and working on some of the like back end stuff for small clients that we had. And the owner of the company came to me and said something along the lines of, "Hey, we'd lined up this contractor for the Android version, and he spent a couple of weeks thinking through some stuff, but had to step away. And so now we have a pretty short timeline. And how do you feel about learning Android and delivering this in our few months that we've committed to?" And I didn't take it as a question. It was it was a nicely phrased command.
So what was your knowledge base at that point? You said you were doing Ruby on Rails?
Yeah, so I'd worked my way through college doing engineering jobs. So I had been a professional salaried developer for 3 or 4 years at that point. This was in my final year of school, and I'd worked for a PHP shop for a while. Was doing Ruby on Rails for a bunch of clients through this consultancy. I had done a bit of iOS, so kind of spread out, but mostly web.
Well, I'm looking at the shirt. We won't talk too much about iOS, even though that's my general world here. And this eventually brought you out to the Bay Area.
Yeah, so I worked in the Dallas area for a few years after graduation, and started working for Handmark, which was actually they built the first app store for Palm. So they kind of an old software company doing like Windows Mobile before the Windows Phone, when it was like Windows Mobile 5 and 6 and Palm apps and that sort of thing. And they had contracted us when I was at the other one to do Zagat, and I eventually took a full-time role with them. So they just kind of poached me from the smaller group they were contracting with, and worked there on more Android work explicitly. So it was the second version of Zagat. So I'd owned kind of V1 and V2 as the sole developer. And I built Sprint's SMS and MMS and group messaging client that was preloaded and on a lot of different Android phones at the time. So this was all 2009, 10, 11-ish. So this was very early versions of Android when the tech stack was a lot more atrocious to work with than it is today. And eventually that led me to starting to engage in the community a bit and coming out to the Bay Area for conferences and as just an attendee, not contributing in any way. And had this desire to get out of Texas and live somewhere pleasantly temperature and kind of be in the center of things. And did some interviewing and took a job out in the Bay Area at Evernote.
Now, you talked about the Bay Area being an entirely different beast and not a cheap place to live, but you're also coming out of Dallas, which also is not exactly a cheap city. Or am I wrong about Dallas there?
It's a different cost bracket altogether, but it's not incredibly cheap either. You know, it's a similar, a
but
little bit cheaper than
not the Bay
Austin
Area,
or some of the other more expensive cities. But your compensation and everything else is also much lower when you're outside of the Bay Area for the most part as well.
Yeah, I'm based out of Pittsburgh, and we've never really had a housing bubble here.
Yeah.
So your compensation is much lower in Pittsburgh, but you can also wind up getting yourself a 5-bedroom house for under $300,000, and that's unheard of everywhere else.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, when I was there, almost 10 years ago now, you could definitely get that price point. There was nicer areas where it was more expensive, and you were looking in the 400 or 500 range. But for the most part, you could get a lot of space in most of the suburbs around Dallas-Fort Worth for a couple $100,000 or so.
So one of the things you mentioned is that you had a lot of sacrifices to be made in moving to the Bay.
I mean, I think it's just a different lifestyle, right? I was used to a very sprawly city where I had a full house, and me and my ex-wife and our 2 dogs had a 3-bedroom just for us, and a big yard and a 2-car garage, and and that was a very low price point. Working in tech and moving out to the Bay Area, when you, especially for folks that transplant initially before they've kind of built up their network or really optimized their income or taken advantage of stock and different other things that kind of help elevate folks' network in the Bay Area, it can be pretty challenging for folks. A lot less space, but you're also getting used to it. Other types of lifestyle changes as well, less using the car, but also finding an entirely different culture out here where people are a lot, at least what I found, it was easier to make friends and really feel like I was kind of one with the area, and you found a lot of diversity in thought and a lot more ambition. And that's not to kind of pick on these other areas, but when you come to the Bay, it does kind of pull as a nexus point for a lot of folks that kind of fall into those categories. And so it's interesting to be around that.
And you seem to have done fairly well for yourself. You've got a nice room with a large expanse there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, for the viewers, my background on Zoom is from the Expanse. I'm in a spaceship, so clearly that's a reasonable price point in the Bay Area.
You're a bit of a science fiction nut, right?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that sci-fi was formative in my upbringing and has definitely given me the inspiration to get into tech and continues to make me help me with creative thought and thinking about things differently and looking forward to what we can build and what we can accomplish.
But I have to ask, are you a Whovian?
I am, although to admit it, I probably am 2 or 3 seasons behind the current. So
I hear that a lot from people. It rotates from when it airs from time to time, and it's hard to keep up with.
Yeah.
But I will say I do enjoy Jodie Whittaker in the role. It's a refreshing change.
I've heard great things.
All right, let's talk a little more tech. You have held positions, and you speak a lot about the difference between a lead engineer and a managing engineer.
Yes.
And you have been in both positions, and you've now finally settled. You're back more on the tech side of things.
That's right.
What is the draw there? Why the tech and not the management?
I think that's a very interesting and probably long-winded conversation. So
that's what we're here for.
I've been at Uber about 5 years, coming up on 5 years, and I have been on a number of different teams working with different types of folks. and have definitely seen the opportunity to try out different ways of impacting and being a leader. For the first couple of years I was here, I was working with a manager that was kind of coached me and gave me guidance and like thinking about the sorts of things to be effective organizationally, thinking about interacting with other teams and other leaders and managers and stakeholders. And I spent a lot of time there, and I was tech leading a group, so I was also mentoring folks in the team and helping them grow. Kind of coming to it from a position of caring deeply about the people and empathy and work-life balance and sustainability and treating folks fairly in the industry. And kind of took a lot of those cares, and at some point the opportunity arose for me to step into a tech lead manager role, which is more unique to some companies, but it's I think it originated at Google, or one of the FANG companies, and it's the idea of a smaller team where the manager is able to stay more technical and continue to contribute code and then it's a very like narrow charter that's very focused in a specific area. So I'd been working in developer tools for a while at that point, doing libraries and frameworks and build tools and all kinds of things kind of along those, and owning a big portfolio of products. And we had the opportunity to manage there. So I stepped into a tech lead manager role around the same time that the overall senior manager of the group had left. So that was an interesting year and a half or so, where I was a peer to a couple other managers of these sub teams working in developer tools, and we were supporting upwards of 400 mobile developers at Uber, probably, with a group of maybe 20 or so people all together, spread across a couple different managers, and all reporting up to a senior director. And at that point, it was a lot of really interesting growth opportunities and challenges, both learning how to, the difference in mentoring someone and managing someone, and holding folks accountable for their growth, and trying to manage stakeholders and everything else at the level of accountability that comes with the manager. And for a lot of reasons, I eventually decided that that role in itself, tech lead manager, often should be split into two people that are able to more effectively do both roles. It should be a tech lead who mentors folks but is the technical leader with the headspace to really drive that vision, and a technical but not actively contributing engineering manager, so that they don't feel the pull or the conflict in having to split their time and not give the people on the team the appropriate amount of headspace. So eventually I helped bring on a very good friend of mine as a manager at Uber, and had stepped down into a tech lead role. And now I'm pretty happy with how the organization and the team is looking, where I'm one of the leaders in a group where we have a very strong mobile visibility inside of our infra org, and we're supporting 400 plus mobile engineers. And I have the headspace to really think about the platform's vision and what we're wanting to build for our developers and for the community, and still support and really give a lot of headspace to the people, but less of the manager side, where that comes with performance review and sourcing candidates, and often stepping up to gaps that were missing from the organization, like acting as a TPM or a senior manager if that wasn't there. A lot of other areas that would have pulled me. Now I'm able to kind of use that headspace to progress technically and help the team really grow technically.
Yeah. There's the way that you explain this, it feels like that basically you went from an engineer to being a tech lead manager. And this was kind of like a career growth for you, I believe. And
Yeah.
This is why you probably opted for this, right? So my question though is that this is a unique position, I think, for career growth, which kind of only is in the Silicon Valley, I believe.
Yeah.
But for people, those who are outside Silicon Valley, and if they wanted to have something similar for their career growth, how would they be looking for something similar? Or like, I don't know, maybe in your experience, what do you think would be the right way to approach it?
I think that's a very interesting question. So, as much as I kind of said there's positives and negatives about the role itself, a common joke that I heard was that a tech lead manager is the worst of both worlds. It's more challenging to be a good engineer, and it's more challenging to be a good manager, which kind of led me to my conclusion of, hey, most of the time we should probably split this into the two different tiers. And so, if you think about it that way, and you're talking about engineering growth, I don't think it being Silicon Valley or not matters. You have a tech ladder for engineers to grow, staying purely technical, and often a ladder for managers to grow and expand their scope and their organizational influence, and how many folks and kind of the direction they're going. So that's common in Silicon Valley, right, where you have the IC tech ladder, and I think that's common outside of Silicon Valley as well, to some degree. So that's what I would encourage folks to think about. Whether they want to continue to grow very technically as an engineer and past what is considered the terminal level. If you're looking at many of these companies, you get up to senior engineer, someone can comfortably stay at senior engineer for the rest of their career. There's no expectation of going past that. But for the folks that are more ambitious and growth oriented and really want to push the bar, they can get up to senior 2 or staff or whatever these companies call the roles above that. So one, it's kind of identifying, do I want to take on this additional scope, and do I want to grow and kind of push the bar here? So at the end of the day, a lot of people just want to spend their time coding cool stuff. And whether or not you're managing, the higher you get, the more influence you're having to kind of exert, and it does kind of pull away from some of that cool hacking and individual building that happens.
A lot of people seem to think that the tech ladder has sort of a ceiling to it. There's engineer, senior engineer, lead engineer, architect, but there seems to be that fear that you have to make that bridge to management. And do you feel that that's changing?
I don't. I think it's perception more than anything else. So with manager tech ladders, you're seeing manager 1 and 2 and senior manager and director and VP and on and on and on. And I think there's more of an expectation of folks trying to grow through that ladder. On the engineer side, I hear a lot of folks that express the concern about growing and getting up the tech ladder. But at the end of the day, I think there's also an unhealthy perception about being a little too focused on that and the expectations on that after getting past the career level. So you have a lot of folks more junior in their career that, and rightfully so, want to try to get to senior engineer where they're autonomous and people trust them to do good work and on projects and different things like that. But getting past that really is a much more limited pool. And the more that good managers can help folks understand that perception, and if they really do want to grow and what that means for that next role versus kind of embrace where they're at and not see that as a downside, I think that's a healthier team dynamic. There's a book called Radical Candor, where the author, I can't think of her name right now, Kim something. She coins the idea of on a team you have 2 different personality types. You have rock stars, and a rock star is rock star and superstar, I think are the 2 terms. And she views rock star as like a point of stability in the team, where you need a lot of folks that are rock stars because they're comfortable where they're at and they're learning and growing. They're providing a point of stability, and that provides some room for a smaller group of folks to really try to push up and grow and lead that way. And if you have everybody trying to fight and grow and push out of the expectation, the team dynamics there aren't going to be necessarily a healthy place to be.
That's interesting. I have another question for you. This is, I think, because I was going through the things that you have done and also going through your chapter in the book. My question to you is that you got into this dev advocacy, or basically improving developer tooling and experience because in the initial days of Android, is what your experience was not good, or what? Is this just led you into this?
I I think for a number of reasons, but I think that's that's one good way of phrasing it. If you look at the beginning days of Android, when I started, it was 2008 or 9, and Eclipse was awful, and build tools were awful, and the devices sucked, and there were so many issues. The ecosystem really hadn't developed or matured much at all, and it was pretty painful to work in, and everybody recognized that. It was a common talking point. So there's one element of like just suffering from that perspective. And then two, as I continued to work in bigger companies and work with other engineers, it just became very clear that I had a passion about helping, building for developers as opposed to necessarily building for a consumer. When you're building for a developer, you're building for your peers, and you can get great feedback quickly that helps you hone your own craft, and you can kind of see that effect directly on someone else in a very nuanced and technical way. And so that kind of started with a side project, more or less. I was at Evernote and I was working on the consumer team and for the app, but there just happened to be some projects that were more developer facing that I was able to kind of take ownership on. Some of those were building the intent APIs that other apps use to interface with the Evernote app. So I ended up working with Samsung and other partners that wanted to deeply integrate with the app on the device by providing, a rich API. And, that kind of led me to starting to work on our OAuth SDK wrapper that used the app natively to do, authentication. And that was kind of my first big push into open source and kind of owning that Android SDK. And that really just opened my eyes to kind of the depth of the space and my passion and interest in that. And with that, I was able to work with a really great developer advocate at Evernote who got me kind of hooked up to a couple of conferences, started speaking about it, and really just lit the fire. And I discovered that passion. And from then on, I was seeking opportunities where I would be focused on helping make developers' lives better.
Now, your journey to speaking was not an easy one for you, if I remember correctly. You, like many people, entered into public speaking with terror.
Yes, absolutely. It was something I was very reluctant to do, and that's why I kind of invested heavily in it at the beginning. I recall early days of Android where I would see videos of some of the original people from Google that were giving talks at the first I/O or different events. And I was thinking to myself, oh man, that looks terrifying. But I'd love to be able to do that someday, but I can never do that. And when a couple of years later, I was talking to this developer advocate, Chris Traganos at Evernote, and kind of voiced that as a, man, wouldn't that be cool? But I don't think I could do that. And he put a lot of pressure on me. So he's like, no, we're going to make that happen for you. Like, yeah, you're going to grow past that. And we submitted to a Droidcon in London in 2011 or 2012. It was probably one of the first ones they had. And that, it was terrifying first time around. And that accountability of having that scheduled talk is kind of what drove me to try to get there. And over time, I just did that again and again and again. And, after a couple of years of that consistency, it started to get very comfortable and easy to do. And, at this point, I've probably spoken at hundreds of conferences, and it comes very, very naturally and comfortably, but that was very intentional, right? When I have folks say, oh, you look so comfortable up there, how do you do that? It's practice. Absolutely.
Do you have any advice that you give people who are thinking of going into public speaking for conferences?
Yeah, it depends on what they're coming to it for. I often suggest something similar if their concern is fear of public speaking. It's, go ahead and submit an abstract. I offer feedback and stuff on it, and set up that point of accountability that forces yourself, and then do that 2 or 3 times, and then kind of reflect. Is this for me or is it not? And that's definitely for the person who has kind of a fear of it. The other one I often hear is, oh, that would be fine, but I don't have anything good to talk about, or I can't think of topics. And for that, there's a whole variety of topics. People want to learn everything from beginner content to advanced content. So kind of losing the expectation that you have to be an absolute expert on something and give a very in-depth tech talk on that, I think is pretty healthy. The other interesting thing is when you're giving the talk on something, the research and the prep work for that will help you become more fluent in that piece of technology. So I've definitely subscribed to give talks before that I hadn't yet played with the tech on, just so that it would force me as a teaching or as a learning function to do that. So one example of that is I gave a talk at Gradle's conference, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, that was writing Android build scripts in Kotlin, and this was before there was any official Kotlin script support. And it was mostly me looking at it and saying, that would probably work. How about I submit an abstract on that? And at the time, I didn't even know if I could get it working for the talk. I just thought it would be a fun thing to kind of explore and play with. And it turned out I think I was the first one to get that working and submitted one of the first PRs to Gradle to support Kotlin script.
Turned out pretty well, I guess. Now we have official support, probably.
Absolutely. But if it hadn't gone well, that would have been a fun talk too. It would have been more of a retrospective style. We're like, hey, I tried to do these things, and here were the blockers, and here's how I communicated it to the Gradle team or whatever. It could have been a different type of talk, but it would have been interesting as well.
But you bring a very good point here that a lot of developers and engineers who are now getting into the industry, they kind of think that maybe it's also because of the social media. Sometimes people are tweeting about that, oh, I'm making the presentation at the last moment or something.
Yeah.
So they don't understand how much work there goes in. As you said, that there's a bit of a research that you need to do, you need to figure out. And there's then you learn the technology to basically present in front of people, which I guess is not very common for people those who are just getting exposed to this right away and they're seeing this.
I would say that common stereotype is definitely a point of humor and maybe bragging rights in the DevRel community. I've definitely seen that myself, but that comes from a long position of having a public persona and comfort in that and deep domain expertise. And I've definitely done my fair share of that, where I'm working on the talk on the plane to the conference. But that is definitely a different perspective to think about than your person who's wanting to get into it for the very first time, and is wanting to feel a sense of belonging and welcoming energy from the community, and wants to feel like they're doing something that has value and is of quality.
Also, I think you've already built up the experience of handling that situation, right? Like if someone is new, they just can't just go and do it that way. That doesn't work out. It's the experience, it's the practice, I believe.
Absolutely.
That's useful. But I want to actually stop you at this, and I want to go back to something that we were discussing, and this is about developer advocacy. You mentioned that, and I actually got this question from one of my friends. I think as an engineer, people look at developer advocates as people, those who are promoting a product or something like that. But maybe it's more than that, and you could maybe shed a bit more light on this.
Sure. So the first things, a disclaimer: I'm not a developer advocate, like by trade, right? That's not my title. I like to stay purely in the engineering world. But as one of my old mentors at Google said, he said, Ty's the best DevRel that's never been a DevRel that I know. So, I'd like to be very involved in the space, and I feel like I would probably do very well at that full time. But I want to stay focused on building something entirely, and then with a side percentage of my time, go out and advocate for that and teach people. And that percentage kind of changes if you're doing DevRel or Dev advocacy as your full-time job, or maybe you're not also owning the roadmap for the thing that you're building. But to your question around developer advocacy and it being more of a just pitching a product, it really depends on the company, and it depends on the success of the developer advocate. So the more successful ones that I've seen, I think a great example is my significant other, Chloe Condon. I helped mentor her into the tech industry and get her into DevRel. And now she has helped a lot of companies move to the perspective of investing in their community organically and letting that technological respect then kind of double back and help influence their adoption of their technologies. So with that, it's often about investing in the community through generalized contributions, engaging in meetups and talks and open source on what they care about, and having your product as kind of a side effect of that, not the main pitch. Because as soon as you're pitching the product directly, like then you are a salesperson, and that kind of loses respect in the developer community. But if you have someone who is instead seen as a thought leader in Android or JavaScript or Docker or whatever the domain is, then they're able to relate to the developer and really understand their pain points. And then, sometimes that is with a solution from the company, and sometimes it's not. But at the end of the day, the customer, the developer, is kind of in the front for the developer advocate as opposed to the product.
That's very interesting definition. I think I should have said that. Now that I know, I'll use this. That's a good one. There's a lot of things that are also changing in the mobile industry. You said that you've been doing mobile for some time now, and there's a couple of things, and I think you're very vocal about all the different frameworks that are out there. I think right now you're doing Android, but you've obviously maybe taken a look at iOS, and then there's React Native, Flutter. Sure. I think there's Kotlin multi-platform that's coming in. What's your thoughts on all of this change that's coming right now?
Absolutely. I think a good engineer uses the best tool for the job. And we often see in this industry too many people that kind of stick to a sense of idealism or being the fanboy or fangirl, or really sticking to and defending that in kind of an unhealthy way. And if you're thinking about it from the perspective of using the best tool for the job, the job is much different at a small startup who's just trying to find product market fit and is likely going to go under, versus a big company that needs to have a scaled out user experience that works in a huge range of markets and device types. So when I talk to startups and they say, hey, what should I use? Should I build native apps? Should I do React Native? Should I do it on the web? It really depends on their use case. React Native, I'm not a huge fan of React Native, but I think it has some great use cases. I think if you're a small startup and your primary interaction with your consumer isn't necessarily dependent on a super high quality, performant, scaled mobile application, and you're trying to find product market fit and you're resource constrained, React Native is probably a decent choice. Flutter is another interesting one. Maybe it's a little less reusable as React Native, since for these small startups and the people with this use case, they have something that's sharing the resource domain in their engineers. If it's a web engineer and JavaScript and React, that's very translatable between probably what they're doing on the web and what they're doing in mobile. I think one of Flutter's downsides is that it has, even with their web support and desktop support and other stuff that they've tried to put, it is kind of pitching an entire ecosystem to invest in and learn. And that competes more directly with native mobile than it does with something like React Native. So they kind of lose out on a lot of that market from companies that don't have as much to invest in learning entirely new technology. And then, you have things like Kotlin multi-platform, which very interesting and probably will get a nice adoption in use cases where that makes sense as well. And that's going to depend again on the position that the company's in that needs to adopt that. Do they already have a bunch of Swift engineers and they are investing there with a huge code base? They're not going to migrate to a greenfield Kotlin multi-platform. But maybe if you have a team that is trying to do something new and they are limited in headcount and they're having to integrate with an existing native system, that could be a good choice to build their specific functionality in that.
Now, I really appreciate you saying the right tool for the right job, and that's always been my my belief, and understanding what your market is. I remember many years ago when Douglas Adams came to an Apple conference to talk about his video game, and he said, I will not be releasing this on the Apple platform, as an Apple lover himself, because he says, I want to not go out of business.
Yeah.
if we get enough sales on the PC, then we'll release it for the Mac. And there was just huge derision there because it was people not hearing the business case of it.
Absolutely.
But on the side of, we go beyond the right tool for the right job, there is still a little bit of fanism and the like. And I have to ask you, is there currently a technology that you're playing in that you really are enjoying, or is there a technology that you really would love to go play in?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So one thing that I see coming in the industry for big companies, and that's something I'm investing in pretty heavily for Uber, is remote development for mobile engineers, for Android specifically. I think there's more constraints on the iOS side than there are on Android. That's something that there's been some discussion of recently in the community. Different blogs have popped up. JetBrains put out a open source prototype tool called Projector that allows you to kind of natively render the IDE calls through JavaScript, and so you can kind of pass that over. So I've been investing internally on kind of kicking up a team and playing around with what it looks like for us to do remote development. We have a very, very, very large code base. We have one of the largest Android and iOS code bases in the world. And with that, building on a standard developer laptop is, you have something that requires a huge compute resource to get done. It's not rocket science to throw a large number of resources at that thing to get it done, right? We have thousands of modules that need to be built, and I have, I'm looking at this MacBook Pro that has 6 cores and 32 gigs of RAM. Of course, that's going to be a resource constrained, compilation and developer experience and everything else when we have really beefy servers in the cloud. So, I've been investing in how we can get a native feeling experience, native development feeling experience through, remote resources where we have a big build. Sorry, my Google Home just went off. Where we have a huge number of cores and RAM and everything else that could be used. So I've been playing a lot with that, a lot of like Linuxy stuff and hooking it up through the shell. And now I'm starting to kind of figure out how our team can invest in that for a more productionized and polished environment.
I've heard many teams also use another tool. I think in the past, I mean, the one that you are mentioning is pretty good, and I think it's something that other teams are also investing in. But there was this one tool that I've also heard in the past. It's called Mainframer, I guess.
Yep.
That kind of also does something similar.
Mainframer is a bit different. It's rsync based, so it takes all of your sources and rsyncs them over to a server, and then executes your remote commands on the server, and then rsyncs the build artifacts back out. And that definitely has some pros and some cons related to a full remote development environment. That still runs the IDE on your local machine, and often with larger code bases, the IDE performance itself can become a constraint. So with the Uber monorepo that we're indexing, the performance time and the usability there is a big pain point. And you combine that with larger and larger sets of artifacts that need to be transferred across, even with fast gigabit internet or whatever. There's some overhead on both sides of that operation. And if you compare that to a purely remote environment that feels native, where you're rendering the IDE, it's vector font rendering, it feels fast and native, and you have an emulator or device that's port forwarded across the wire, and you're doing everything, builds, execution, indexing, all of it on a much more powerful computer. That leaves your local machine in a much easier place to use, right? You could do it on a Chromebook, which I think starts to unlock interesting development workflows for many companies as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think VS Code is the other one that's kind of taking a heavy push here. They're doing it slightly different. You have the remote language server like LSPs, and then you still have VS Code running locally, but you're doing all of the like indexing and core IDE operations on a server. But if you step away to more of the Android ecosystem, VS Code just isn't quite there when it comes to the usability that an Android developer would expect.
So I want to steer us back to some of your experiences at Evernote. Now, you were doing open source when you were there as well, not just the internal, but you were doing external open source there as well?
Yes, that's right. When I started there, I was on the product team for the main app. There was one Android team. It was 3 or 4 folks when I joined. And after some work with the various developer-facing products there, like the intents and the content provider and some of the other stuff in the Android app, I started to work on the open source SDK, which wraps the web API in a more ergonomic way to use in a Java stack, and provides an OAuth, a native single sign-on solution that allows a developer that's integrating with it to do a one-click sign-on through the native app itself.
Did you find, so was open source sort of a need, or was it sort of an interest? How did you wind up finding yourself in that?
Sure. So open source was a need at that point. So the company had a developer platform and was investing in growing out their developer customers. Because they had a rich API, they had created a team around that with BD and DevRel and different roles that you would normally expect in the developer platform team, and working with external companies to create a marketplace of apps that had integrated nicely with it and showcase those. And so there was this expansion of developer tools that was required to kind of meet the needs there. And I was splitting my time between the main product team, where I was working on features in the Evernote app, and with the developer platform team, where I was focused on building out and maintaining the SDK, and generally being involved in kind of their developer advocacy efforts, doing some conferences and hackathons and that sort of thing.
Now, some companies have embraced open source, other larger companies don't embrace open source. Where are your general feelings on how open source should fit into larger corporations?
Absolutely. So I think there's multiple use cases for open source, right? You have some companies where the developer tool is their product, and for those, open source gives more transparency and auditability and trust, and allows communities to be developed. And there's a huge number of benefits that come with a developer tool company having their developer product be open source, especially when you're looking at mobile, where these binaries are being bundled in the customer's apps that are going out in the wild, and there's a much higher bar for quality. You can't just hotfix one of these apps when an outage happens or different things like that. There's always going to be these old versions in the wild with this code. So having open source for that is incredibly important, and that's something at Uber I own our third-party review process, where I established the process of how a team would pull in new third-party code. And for mobile, hard requirement is it being open sourced. But that's if I take that back, that's for companies where the developer tool is their product. For companies that want to invest in open source more generally, where you have utilities and tools and everything that come out of that, there's a number of reasons why a company would want to do that, and plenty why they wouldn't want to do that as well. If you think about the available resources and the goals of your company, at some point you are trying to do things like attract more engineers, which is a pretty common reason that people want to get involved in the community. They want folks to see that they have a presence and that they're engaged there in the quality of their engineering. There's a level of altruism and wanting to give back, because all of these companies today are built on open source tools for the most part. And those are two very, very critical reasons that you often see. But then there's another one, which you start to see at some of the bigger companies. And this is the one that kind of deeply drives me at doing this from the scale of an Uber, is the ability to kind of have a hand on the steering wheel for how the community is going. When I started at Uber 5 years ago, we were having to build so much internal stuff that might have had external alternatives, because it just didn't meet the needs. And it was such a big gap that just contributing those back to the open source or the community defined versions of those wasn't really feasible. And so there's a lot of engineering resources that can be, that didn't feel wasted because you're building a duplicate thing because the external stuff didn't meet your needs. And by starting to get really involved in open source, you can help foster that relationship in the community to make sure that what's coming out of the community does meet the needs of the company. So it's a very mutually beneficial relationship. And we have a strong relationship with JetBrains and Gradle and Facebook and Google and Airbnb and a lot of these other companies that are putting these tools out. And we're able to give that feedback quickly and contribute and make sure that what's coming out works well for our use case. And then we can kind of do that with what we're putting out for them to use as well.
And basically become a good citizen now overall in the new community.
Absolutely. It kind of goes back to that sense of altruism, but at some point you're a leader in the community and you're making sure that what is coming out is being built from a perspective of working for your use case and for your partner's use cases, because those partner companies are going to need to kind of do the same thing back with you.
So one of the questions I've been asking this season of a lot of people, because open source has been a continual thread this season, is what kind of advice do you give to somebody who wants to start looking into open source or developing in the open source world?
Yeah, so to clarify your question, are you thinking from like the organizational investment perspective or from an independent engineer?
From an engineering point of view.
Absolutely. So find out, get a pulse on the community first, right? If you don't have a pulse on the community and you put out something that has very standardized alternatives already, it's going to be very hard to get adoption of that. And coming at it from that perspective, it's probably not going to meet the needs of any customers anyway. So get the pulse on the community. Take a look at some of the mid-sized projects to start. If you're looking at those, there's often they have some engagement, they have feature requests and bugs being filed. They have a large number of a medium-sized number of contributors and a large number of contributions. That's an easy space to kind of create a mental model around and come in and find some low-hanging fruit. Often those projects have tasks that are identified as like, hey, getting started tasks. So someone can kind of step in and say, hey, this is an easy bug that maybe I'll go spend a couple days figuring out the code base and solving. So I think that's a really healthy way to think about that. A lot of people try to jump into the really big code bases. If you're looking at like the Kotlin language or Buck or Bazel or AOSP or some of these bigger ones, they can seem really daunting, right? Because it's such a large code base. It's just like going to a new company that has a huge code base. It's going to take a really long time to ramp up and feel comfortable there. And that's with the dedicated resources of the company. So you're taking that medium-sized project that has the contributors and is starting to build a support system, but is still in kind of a grokkable space to create a mental model on, is a lot easier for a new person than the alternative. And contrasting that to building your own thing or finding a very small project where the time and the SLAs between the contributions and the reviewer may be a problem, or they may not have a full understanding of what's needed to be done because there isn't documentation or a good support system or any of those sorts of things. So I think that kind of lends itself well towards the middle of the road sized projects is a first time.
When I asked you this, you wanted clarification about whether or not I was talking about engineering into open source or investing into open source.
Yep.
And it would be a crime if I didn't touch on this. When it talks about investing, you are also now an angel investor.
Yes.
Now, I just wanted you to shift and discuss, to talk a little bit about what is involved and what you do as an angel investor.
Sure. So there's different types of ways that people get involved, financially with startups and that sort of thing. And there's your traditional angel investing where you're creating a large portfolio and you're very hands-on with these companies. And that's just something I haven't found enough time to do actively. So what I do is I work with a couple syndicate companies. So these are syndicate groups. So this is groups that were founded by a bunch of ex-Twitter people when I was there. And it's a hybrid VC technical advisory group that I work with. And with that, I can work as a member and be very involved, but on a kind of scalable way. That's how I really got started with it. And that's allowed me to invest and engage with all kinds of great companies and act as a technical advisor to many of those companies as they start growing and have specific pain points or technical questions that my background aligns with. And it started to open up the opportunities where I do want to get more hands-on with some of the dedicated companies, or invest in a friend's company, or do some real angel investing. So that was I think a really interesting path that is a bit different and a little more approachable than what many folks do for angel investing.
This sounds like something that would work for like maybe in the Silicon Valley, but can it work out in outside Silicon Valley also?
Well, sure. And this sort of thing already happens, right? But in this case, the difference is this syndicate I'm involved with, it's all technical advice. So every person that's in it comes from a very deep background with technical expertise that is able to provide guidance to the companies that we're investing in. If you look outside of Silicon Valley, there's tons of businesses already that have domain consultants and domain expertise that invest in company. Everything from like REITs that are doing real estate investment, and they have consultants on the board. And I think that's a fairly common model, but I don't think you have as much liquidity and hype to throw around in many of those other industries as Silicon Valley does.
Would you say this is similar to the accelerator programs, which also have advisors and have people investing in companies?
No, I wouldn't say it is, but there's some overlap for sure. With angel investing in general, you're working with founders in early stage companies to help them be successful and kind of scale to a point of sustainability and eventually getting a return on investment. The accelerators do that as well, but they're entirely focused on funding, training, and owning a decent percentage of that company. So it's extremely hands-on and very focused on being their primary business goal and motivating factor. Where the approach from like a syndicate or an individual angel investor is going to be much more passive and kind of one of many in the portfolio that's being worked with.
I want to bring things back to working as an engineer. I realize that's a really harsh move from where we just were. That's the beauty of editing it. When you're bringing people in and you're reviewing them, I don't want to say that the whiteboarding is something that people have very different opinions on, though it is. From your point of view, when does it work and what makes it work?
Sure. I think that's a great question. I'm normally, I'm a very vocal advocate against your standard thing in Silicon Valley interview process, because the skills needed in interviewing, while they have some analogy to the day-to-day work, it's an entirely different skill set that's often developed to work, that's quick to recall without information and working under pressure and a time constraint. They just don't mimic, real world scenarios that well. So I'm not a huge fan of those, and where I have opportunity to kind of shift and evolve and give some input there, I've definitely tried my best to make that a thing. At Uber, we do a fairly decent job with that, but I think it really depends on the individual interviewer on how they take the approach to it. So if your standard stereotypical Google interview that people are terrified of before COVID times was on a whiteboard, and you're not accessing information as a reference or seeing if it compiles, working in your IDE with your tools. It's all, and it's a toy problem, right? It's not something realistic. We do try to focus on, a real problem on the computer, building it in the IDE as an app, something that feels realistic for the candidate, right? Where they're, hey, look at this app. It already exists here. Go build some features that do A, B, and C. Now let's go fix a bug here. Now maybe there's a memory leak. We got to find it. Like that sort of thing. And I think that starts to become a more comprehensible and applicable interview versus your standard ones. And that's one that's kind of pretty well defined in our mobile interview loop. at Uber that I am a fan of. But then you can kind of get into some of the other competencies that are being looked for, like algorithm and data structures, or design and architecture, or some of the others that kind of emerge. And then it really depends on the quality of the question and kind of the nuanced understanding of the interviewer. So you could say, hey, Ty, you're going to do an interview with this candidate on data structures and algorithms. And the question could be extremely applicable, or it could range all the way to a very terrible leak code style toy problem that people feel very stressed about. If you said, hey, this is an Android candidate, we need to do something that's going to touch on the competency around data structures and algorithms. Maybe we see their background as like they're very focused in the UI layer, maybe something around view recycling and trying to optimize a list. And you could start to come up with a very practical problem in that space that, when given their tools, becomes fair and helps kind of judge that accurately. Or I could say, hey, invert this binary tree. One of those is going to give much better signal than the other. And that, I won't say that's great, right? Because you're still to a point where folks are under a high pressure environment. They're having to do it in a time constraint. So it's still not a great situation to be in, but it's better than not thinking through the candidate experience at all. And long term, I think we will get to some better options here. But as you start to think about the pros and cons of the alternatives, you think, oh, what about sending them a homework and they spend 3 or 4 hours building something and sending it back, and we can cut down the interview. Then most candidates don't spend 3 or 4 hours on it. They spend 12 or 20 and try to really represent themselves. And if you have a high caliber candidate that's maybe interviewing at multiple companies, they now don't have the time to do this. And it's not, so you're missing out on that caliber of a candidate. Or maybe they're, in a more unfortunate situation where like it's an accessibility problem. Maybe it's a single mother who has like taking care of the kids at night and working during the day and doesn't have time to do a big problem like that. Like there's all kinds of issues that can pop up, like with good intent, of course, but then these issues start to pop up. Or if you look at maybe a company, I don't know if they do it anymore, but Mapbox used to bring people on site as a contractor for a couple sprints as an alternative. And that's a really interesting idea as well. But then you think about the limited number of people who have the flexibility to go work in a contract for a couple of weeks before taking a full-time role, and the amount of investment that goes into that. So, there's all these thoughts about it, but I don't think we're to a great place in the industry yet.
One of the things that gets lost in the conversation about interviews is that the interview is two-way.
Of course.
That many people always think about the interview as I go in there, I dance, and then I leave and maybe I have a job. What are some of your views on the way you want to represent things to the candidate to make a positive interview from their point of view?
Absolutely. I mean, you want to give the candidate a problem that's scalable, right? That it kind of demonstrates level, and it's very forgiving on the amount of domain experience that may or may not be required to really get to a good problem in it, so that they can feel like they made a good dent in it, and not feel like, oh, I was missing this thing and I just failed miserably. Like, you want them to walk away feeling satisfied and kind of like proud of what they were able to demonstrate. You want to save plenty of time to really give the candidate an opportunity to ask great questions and give good feedback and really try to go deep and explain those concepts, and be prepared to try to figure out what the candidate's really looking for in those shallow questions that may get asked, and go deep on those. And you want to not be a blank wall as they're doing their problem. You want them to view it as a collaborative experience. They're not doing this with you over their shoulder and you maybe throw a hint out or two, but this should be you pretending you've never seen the problem before and being a collaborative peer that's like, oh yeah, let's do this thing together, and be very approachable and thoughtful and helpful, and really try to dig out that signal on how they are to work with and how they think through these issues.
So the dreaded question that comes up at every interview at the end, and now you've been both a managing developer and a lead engineer is, do you have any questions for me? What kind of questions, as an interviewer, are you hoping they'll ask?
Oh, that's a great question. Anything that really allows, at that point, you want to get an opinion on what they care about. And from those questions, you can get you can observe many different competencies that are coming through. Are they very idealistic about like one way of doing things or like a type of technology? Are they very interested in like a sense of ownership or collaboration with other teams? How are they as a, how are they organizationally effective? And so like lots of questions will kind of speak to that as kind of a second order effect. Like, hey, what do our relationships with the stakeholders look like on the team? How do we manage priorities coming in from other teams? How do, what kind of visibility into leadership do we have? How do we report things to them? What's the overhead to that? What does the triaging and prioritization process look like, from product? Like, there's lots of questions like that can kind of allow for really interesting conversation.
I think one of my favorite was asking somebody what their CI was like, and they said, well, we sort of build it ourselves and push.
Yeah, it also gives you a great opportunity to like uncover the things under the rug and be honest with those. Like, hey, what are your biggest pain points for developers? Mm-hmm. How do you guys measure the pain points for developers? Like, how often do you do planning? How much of a time suck is planning? How do your developers feel about the performance cycle? Is it generally positive? Not, you have a lot of things like that kind of speak to them being a good citizen in the ecosystem.
So I knew once I got you coming up with questions, they just start flowing.
Yeah.
One unique one that I've heard about is that someone asked the interviewer that what is the hardest problem that you're trying to solve right now? Yeah. And the interviewer's answer was basically them saying that we are basically trying to find a good Android developer right now. That's the hardest problem we have.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a good comment from Jeff Seibert. He was one of the founders of Crashlytics, and I worked with him at Twitter. He commented the job of the CEO is to take the full-time role of what is the most important problem and then replace yourself. And, in many ways, a lead engineer or, a leader in the team, like that's their job as well. It's to find like the most important thing that they should be doing for the team and fill that and replace themselves.
Okay. So Ty, you have obviously been managing many people while being a manager, and also like you yourself being one of those engineers getting managed by people, I guess. So how do you contrast your role to like also being a mentor? Because now as you transition into being a manager, you started like also looking after people, and then maybe at some point you had the opportunity of mentoring people also, I guess.
Yep. I think there's a lot of overlap there, but they can be quite different. And I've mentored and been mentored by many people throughout my career, and I've helped many of those folks achieve things that they're very proud of, and I've been helped by my mentors as well. And originally, when I thought about getting into management, it was my experience acting as a mentor that made me think that I would enjoy and be good at managing. Like there is that overlap there, but there's quite a bit of difference as well, right? A mentor is often it's an entirely voluntary position for both parties that are interacting. So the expectations are different coming out of that. If I'm mentoring someone and they're receiving the guidance that I'm giving, that they're incentivized to act on that and use that because it's a voluntary relationship for the mentorship, right? Like they wouldn't be asking for that if they didn't think this was a good, healthy dynamic and they were looking for that guidance to act on. As a manager, it's a little more, it can be a lot more one way, right? There's holding folks accountable for things. So they're setting expectations, and it was not as voluntary, right? Like, of course, being in that job is voluntary, but they may not necessarily want to do the thing that the manager thinks that they need to do, or that the team is prioritizing, or these other things. And that's where that dynamic can be quite different. It can mimic the mentorship dynamic if the person is receptive and if you're kind of if it acts in the same way. That should look no different than mentorship at that point. But if you have someone who views that differently and has differing opinions or has issues that you're trying to correct, then that can start to be a much different and more challenging situation.
One of the things that you said in the book, and I really love it, and I try to read one quote that's not the one that has been highlighted, is that you'll have managers and you'll have mentors and you'll have senior engineers to try to push on you and to try to help you. But at the end of the day, you're an adult with a career and your growth is your responsibility. I think that's a really important impetus for people to gather and to grab onto.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, we're all adults in this community, and as much as sometimes there are weird authoritative perspectives and manager to IC sorts of relationships, if what you do with your career is entirely in your camp, and the growth and the opportunities is not someone else's job to present to you. You need to be able to identify those and work with the right people and find those and push with the direction that you want to be going. And oftentimes you have great allies and people that kind of help amplify your journey in that. But at the end of the day, it's not about, hey, I'm just going to code and then everything's going to come to me. You need to own your own career.
And what do you think, how does this mentorship kind of contrast with leadership?
I think leadership is closer to the, it definitely, it's an umbrella term that kind of fits both, I think, as well as other things. In leadership, your technical leadership or product leadership, you have these different ways of thinking about it. And you're responsible for driving something forward to resolution, to success, to whatever growth is expected of their project delivery, whatever. And you have different levers in kind of your tool belt for how you operate with other people. Sometimes that's, if you're a tech lead, it's delegating and getting folks to do certain things. And the accountability, that one-way accountability isn't quite as the same as with the manager, right? In that case, it's, hey, you didn't deliver this, you did it wrong, let's change it. For the manager, it may be, hey, you offended this other person that you worked with and you need to figure out how to improve that working relationship. Those are very different conversations that a technical leader could be having to a manager. And then the mentor's job isn't to force, right? It's to be there as a point of guidance. So in that case, maybe the person can come to the mentor and say, hey, I had this interaction with this peer and it ended poorly. Kind of what guidance, how do you think I should approach this? And then it's really their choice in how they interpret that and kind of act on that. And all three of those different types are leaders, right? It's all leadership, but there's very different outcomes and ways of operating that happens with those.
So one of the topics we like to talk about are books that influence you. And I found it interesting that you tend to be leaning more toward audiobooks than paper books.
Yeah, I think that's pretty true. And I tend to absorb a lot more fiction than nonfiction. I find it, we mentioned at the very beginning that I'm a sci-fi nut. And I think that's very intentional because I get a lot of inspiration and, get the creative juices flowing from that type of consuming that type of story. So I do spend a lot of time in very interesting, thought-provoking fiction. Lately, a genre that I've been very absorbed by is the new weird genre. So that you could think of that like the Area X trilogy or House of Leaves, or like the recent game Control. It kind of all fits into the new weird genre. Welcome to Night Vale is another good one. Yeah, and then just a lot of other like deep technical sci-fi that is very interesting to consume and makes you think about, hey, what could we be doing in 50 years, in 100 years, in a couple hundred years? Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy is another great one. That's like a very like deep technical and scientifically accurate-ish approach to what it would look like for us to kind of try to colonize Mars eventually. And so like
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Those types of books are something that I like to spend my time with, limited and more audiobook, because I can do it as something that's going on in parallel. And then my main reading and consuming it, it might be more technical documentation or white papers, or I read a lot of like medical literature, and like none of those are in like the book category. And so the fiction is a nice way to kind of augment that in what I'm consuming.
Did you read any Crichton or Bradbury?
Yeah, not in a while though. I think one of the very first books I remember was Bradbury's Martian Chronicles. No, what was the name of it?
Yep, Martian Chronicles.
Yeah, I think I read that in like 4th grade, and that's kind of stuck with me for a really long time.
I only asked about the Crichton because it was more technical science fiction.
Yeah.
And
absolutely. Daniel Suarez is another very interesting one. He was I think he was a Microsoft software engineer, and now is full-time writing, and he does like techno thrillers that are pretty interesting, based in like AI and nanotech and some of like the emerging tech that we like to think about regularly. But in the nonfiction side, I've been reading lately, kind of started it, a friend gave it to me, How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, which is an interesting kind of thought exercise in like consciousness hacking and changing perspectives. And it's more growth oriented in that way, which is a topic that I get into occasionally.
I was amused by the fact that you added on Mark Manson's Subtle Art of Not Giving an F.
Oh yeah, that one kind of goes more into that growth hacking category of focusing on well-being and how you spend your energy and those you deal with and the problems that you're working on.
Yeah, I found it. I find it leads an interesting parallel to what chronic pain sufferers refer to as the spoon theory, where they're allocating certain amounts of energy throughout the day for their daily activities.
Yep. No,
you can only burn so much, and I always felt that Manson's Subtle Art is very similar to that you need to manage the energy consumption that you're putting your efforts into.
Absolutely, and it's something that I outside of work, I mentor folks like getting into tech and earlier in their career, and often in that the problem of prioritizing which problem should be focused on is a big issue that folks often run into earlier in their career, and I think that really helps solidify how people should be thinking about limiting the amount of things that they can focus on at one time and really care about, right?
Ty, I realize that there are tons of topics. Is there anything else you'd love to hit on before we?
I mean, not. I could go deep on many more things, but I think we covered a lot today. So nothing. Could always give a pitch for my team's hiring, so maybe people can come work with me if they want to learn more.
Yeah, I was about so Uber is hiring, and now we know how your interview process goes.
Yeah, come on over. My manager and I are definitely trying to grow the team out. So happy to hear from more iOS and Android folks that want to work on developer tools and think about these kind of things.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Ty, this has been, like I said, a lot of fun. This is some really great stuff, and I'm really happy that you came and joined us today on this episode. Thank you so much for your time.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me.
If you want to find more about Ty, you can find his website is TySmith, TYSMITH.me. Twitter is tsmith. You can always find Nishant on Twitter at nisrulz, NISRULZ, or RULZ, because you are in Europe.
Yes.
I am Podcast Dru. Coming up in the next episode, Corey Lee Ladislaw is going to be on, an international keynoter and avid sketchnoter, and it'll be wonderful talking with her. 2 weeks after that, Fernando Quejas is going to be on, and if you have any questions for Fernando, Almost got that one out without tripping through it. If you have any questions, please email us at podcast@raywenderlich.com. In the meantime, we will be seeing you again with our next episode in 2 weeks. Corey Lee Ladislaw for Nishant, and thank you, Ty, again. I'm Drew Freeman, and we will take things back to the Emerald Castle. Ray, back to you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the raywenderlich.com podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave a rating on iTunes. See you next time.